Well, good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, everybody, and good morning online. This is the third week of Missional Parenting, our June equipping class. The primary aim of parenting, maturity. I'm convinced that when we get this aim right, and it's aligned with a similar aim as our spiritual journey, then we're pursuing the path of parenting that would be both biblical, both practical, and prayerfully successful in obtaining maturity for our children. And so that's really what the idea of this talk is going to be about. And one of the things you're going to see is, foundationally, this idea is grounded in Scripture. Okay, and so what I mean by that is if we look throughout Scripture, and I'm going to look specifically at some passages, Ephesians 1, Philippians 1, Colossians 1, Paul constantly introduces his letters with these prayers for believers to grow. He said, grow in your knowledge, grow in your depth of insight, grow in your wisdom, your discernment, your understanding, and maturity. That's the objective of our walk, of our believers. In addition to Paul, the writer of the Hebrews, James, we see throughout their writings, he keeps saying, we've seen references like stop thinking like children. In your thinking, be adults. You ought to be teachers, you ought to be grown by now, but you need someone to teach you. Solid food for the mature. Let us be taken forward to maturity, mature in the full measure of Christ, on and on. The mission verse for discipleship as a whole is Colossians 1, 28 and 29, and it really talks about the objective of discipleship. And it says that we teach in Him, in Jesus, we teach in order to bring others to Christ-like maturity. It's sort of our why is wrapped around the idea of reaching or obtaining maturity. Spiritual, I understand, this is about our faith maturity, but it truly is about being hand in hand with the example of God the Father, pursuing us as His children, and pursuing the idea and the example of growing in maturity. Does that make sense so far? We're good? We're good with that, right? So the Bible's constant emphasis is on maturing. And what I'm going to suggest is that's also the example that we're giving in our own relationship with our children, is to pursue their maturity. And what we're going to see is the same connection between in our faith. So in Scripture, when we don't pursue maturity, we have this tendency to skew to one end or the other, right? So we skew to the side of pursuit of happiness, pleasure, selfishness, self-centeredness, or we tend to skew to a side of religious legalism, right? Obedience, ritual, something very rigid. The exact same thing that we see as parents, that there are these basic parenting philosophies that when we don't pursue children's maturity, then we skew to one end or the other. I don't know if you guys have ever seen this, but there's a parenting philosophy that would say, I'm going to be a little more permissive, I'm going to be a little carefree, and everything I do is around the children's happiness. That's my goal, is for my children to be happy. Okay? We do it in subtle ways, we do it in intentional ways, or we have a tendency to skew to this other side, this extreme that says, no. My goal is to ensure that my children are obedient. I want them to behave. I want them to obey. This is going to be a very rigid, harsh, maybe oppressive, but that's what they need, right? And so when we think about these two extremes, we're missing really the whole aim. And so this is what this is grounded in. So I'm kind of building up on the introduction that the aim is when we're aiming for maturity. That's a biblical balance that often encompasses and should encompass both the happiness and the obedience. And we're going to talk about how we get there. We're also going to see that in Scripture, again, when we think about it that way, the primary concern for God's children, followers of Jesus, adopted with the language of infants and children into a family with the language of sons and daughters, is not happiness or obedience in Scripture. It never is. But it's the process of growing and maturing into spiritual adults. What's the churchy word that we use for what I'm trying to describe? Sanctification. And in a way, we kind of can wrap our minds around the idea that we're moving our children through a sanctification process. Okay? A couple of other thoughts is that really throughout the Bible, but also throughout civilization, if we look at the history of sort of the human race, and we go back centuries and centuries and centuries, the goal has always been the idea of moving our children toward maturity. It has never been the idea of a Peter Pan life. That's never been the goal for our children. And what do I mean by that? What's a Peter Pan life? Yeah, I don't want to grow up. I don't ever want to grow up. Right? The little song around it, right? He sings the whole song about it. And so that's never been the goal until the last couple of generations, quite honestly. And these are observations. These are both secular and faith-based experts speaking into this, that over the last couple of generations, we have seen more and more children, we're going to use the word adolescence here in a little bit, who are stuck in this perpetual neverland. They are living the Peter Pan life. Do you guys agree with this? Has adulting become a four-lettered word? And that's what we're going to try to correct today as well in this session, is that's not a bad thing. For the history of mankind, for Scripture itself, adulting is the goal, not something to avoid. And much of it is not the fault of the children. It's the fault of the parents who make it less desirable to adult, who don't encourage adulting. I think about what the conversation between Wendy and Peter. Wendy says, well, Peter, you are both ungallant and deficient. And Peter says, how am I deficient? And Wendy says, well, you're just a boy. You're just a boy. There's a recognition that your deficiency is you're not complete. You've not grown into your full potential. And I think that's really sums up what the perspective is about this idea of growing into maturity, what the goal is, right? Okay, so adulting is not a four-letter word. That's what we want to sort of talk through. In fact, it's so much not a four-letter word that, again, throughout the history of our civilization, created God's image. We have been created as aspirational beings who are moving forward. We're forward movers. We're forward looking. God's people were looking toward the promised land. They were looking toward the Messiah. They were looking toward the hope of eternal glory over and over and over. What does Jesus even say? He says, for those who will have their hands on the plow and look back. Does anybody know that passage, that verse? He says they're not fit for the kingdom. And he's speaking to this idea that there's an urgency in front of us. There's a perspective and a priority in front of us that when we understand our purpose, when we understand that we have been created in order to help advance the kingdom, and we're to look forward to this hope of glory, eternal glory, then that's something we desire, is that forward-looking future potential. And so a couple of qualifiers. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a therapist. I'm also not advocating looking past today. Okay, so really a great qualifier up front. To live in the present is not the same thing as to stay in the present. Okay? Don't ever rush a day with your child. Don't ever wish away today in order to get them moved on. It's a big difference, and we're going to talk about that differences, but please hear me. I'm not saying hurry up and get them out of the house when I say our responsibility is to move them to maturity as soon as possible. There's a difference, okay? So live in the present, just don't stay there. I try not to be a grumpy old get off my lawn fuddy-duddy. And I'm really not even saying that the problem is with millennials or Gen Zers. I really am not. I'm saying that just as much or more the problem has started and has been encouraged by boomers and Gen Xers. And at the very least, what I'm saying is that we're all in this together, okay? This isn't these parents today should, okay? Please don't read this at all. This is what do we do as a culture? What do we do as a church body and community to encourage and build one another up? Also, I'm not advocating a one-size-fits-all, okay? There are different ages that our children mature. I'm also not focusing today on the ultimate concern for our children, that of spiritual maturity. It certainly is the ultimate pursuit, but this is more of parents and those supporting parents working out their faith, okay, in a way that provides practical solutions for our children, okay? Although it's very much hand in hand, okay? So that's a lot of what I'm not as qualifier. I will say what I am, who I am, is I am a dad, 2 daughters, 2 adult daughters. By far, not a perfect dad, was not, am not. In fact, much of what we're going to talk about, I do wish that I had employed even more of. I wish I had sort of come to a realization of, wow, this would have been helpful, 6 years ago. But I do feel blessed that there were many around us that helped to model this and teach us. And so that's my heart. And I do know that the pursuit of maturity every single year was more fulfilling and richer with my girls than the prior year. And I do credit that to the pursuit of their maturity above all else. Not always their happiness, which I'll share some examples later. Definitely not strict obedience, though we certainly wanted them to obey, but the pursuit of maturity. Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to begin with this idea of what the problem is. And I'm going to do it with sort of a look at literature. I want to talk about a little bit of a book review. There were these 2 books. One was written by a guy named George Orwell, titled 1984. Anybody familiar with it? What can you tell me about it? Yeah, it was about a very oppressive, totalitarian sort of government or authority, right? That would be a very rigid rule. That is what ultimately would be sort of dooming for society. Okay, 1984. Anybody else on that? You recall anything? Very much Big Brother, right? In fact, you look at the book, the cover was actually originally like an eyeball, like Big Brother's watching you. I think that was the phrase in the book, right? Big Brother's watching you. There was another book entitled A Brave New World. Aldous Huxley. What do we remember about Brave New World? There would be a lot of information. You already said that, yeah. Anything else about Brave New World? I think there's actually made a TV series or something about it now. That's the pill, yeah. The pleasure pill, right? This would be a society for which we would pleasure ourselves to death. That would be the end of society because of how much, just sort of the carefree, quite the opposite, and that would lead to the death of future generations. Okay, so brave world. Neil Postman sort of summarized the differences in the 2, and I think this is always really interesting to think about. He says what Orwell, 1984, feared were those who would ban books. Huxley feared was that there would be no reason to ban a book, for there'd be no one who would want to read one. Orwell feared those who would deprive us information. Huxley feared there would be so much information we would be reduced to passivity and egoism. So that's the question. Who seems to have been more accurate in their prediction? Huxley? Agree pretty much across the room, right? Hashtag you only live once. Hashtag you do you. Hashtag look at me. Hashtag pleasure, power, possessions, right? On and on and on. At least in the Western world. That seems to be what has touched every aspect of society. The church, of course, parenting, but every aspect of society seems to be moving in this way that Huxley had defined and been more accurate. And so that is an element of what is really changing and making more difficult this parenting to maturity aspect, because it affects something that we call adolescence. What is adolescence? Described, it's called the rigorous, intentional phase of preparation for adulthood. It's when we transition into learning how to work, how to interact in a social setting, how to be responsible, right? We think about the image, there's really like 2 bookends. There's childhood, and there's adulthood, and then there's this middle, adolescence. And adolescence is really the bridge from childhood to adulthood. Adolescence is where the last several generations have found themselves stuck in a perpetual neverland. And we see what happens in adolescence, or should be happening, right? And over the last quarter century, this phase has shifted more dramatically than over the past 200 years. Historically, adolescence has been the years of age 10 to age 16, right? Think about history. And this isn't always good, right? Age 10, come on, son, 75 years, get to the coal mine, right? Come on, daughter, 12 years old, let's work the farm, right? So there was like this instant sort of, childhood, adolescence is really quick, and now I'm an adult and I'm 14. Okay, so that's been the history, but across the past several centuries, it's been about 10 to 16 years of age. Okay, even in the later part of the 19th century, 16, 17, we should be into adulthood. What's recognized now as the period of adolescence are the ages 17 to 25 plus. Despite an earlier puberty. Hormonally, we're getting there sooner. From a maturity standpoint, we're getting there later. You guys catch that? That's like Danger, Will Robinson, right? You think about what's those shifts. Okay, so that's part of the society. That's part of this impact of what Huxley kind of called out, right? Not perfectly, but was describing. That's an aspect of the society that overpleasures itself to death, impacting adolescence. But regardless of the age, even if you want to say, well, adolescence should be 19, it should be 14, it should be 20, whatever it is, the real tragedy is that there are very few intentional plans for getting out of adolescence. And that's what I want to make sure everybody walks away from here. Is if anything else in your parenting, have a plan with your child to move them through adolescence. Together, work on that plan, right? It's often what we'll say is, we'll start when they're little and say, I don't want them to grow up. I don't want them to grow up. That's great. Live for the day. Don't rush it away, right? As they start to get older, middle school, high school, we say, they're growing up so fast. I don't want them to go, right? And then they get out of college. You know what? We'll come back. That's okay. You don't have to grow up yet. You'll grow up when you're ready. And that's sort of this sort of lacking of planning, right? And so that's part of what has happened more in the past two generations than ever before. And again, biblically, historically, we want to see that how do we push through that, all right? All right, so there's two choices for adolescence. There is we have a plan called moving beyond, moving through. And what that might look like, I would suggest, is that our children arrive at adulthood, whatever that age for them individually might be, sooner than later though, fully formed, resilient, self-reliant, problem-solving, fully capable of responsibly engaging in the world around them. They view themselves as called to purposeful pursuits. That's the arrival of adulthood. Plan B is really no plan. Perpetually. It's like being at the roundabout but never getting the exit. Continually at the roundabout, never getting the exit. You could say that this is really a state of drifting, passive, dependent, perpetual adolescence, consumed with self, mindless consumption, making irresponsible decisions, shutting out the world around them, avoiding that four-letter word at any cost. Okay, so that would be the no plan. And even as we look at Proverbs that say following a plan A like this sort of leads to blessing, leads to peace, leads to rest, remember those are Proverbs, all right? Those are general truths. And our responsibility is to pursue plan A. If our children don't take that responsibility as well as they can, then that's in a spiritual sense between them and the Lord. You have done your duty. You have done your calling. You have been responsible as parents. And that's what we have to do, all right? So the outcome is not always guaranteed. But if we don't follow and prefer plan A, then we know it's pretty well guaranteed the other way. Okay. The first is this. We live in a time where it would be said it's the most medicated generation of youth in history. Okay? Some of it very, very good stuff. Again, this is just a fact. This is not judging what's going on. Oftentimes, the more medication can lead to extended adolescence because it's used as coping, it's used as excusing. It does result often in fatigue, lethargic sort of perspective of the world, depression. These things all have an impact on moving through adolescence, okay? I'll give you a couple of just figures on this too. In 2017, the CDC stated that over 11% of children ages 4 to 17, 11%, 1 in 10, are on ADHD medication. Again, some of it very necessary, good. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. You have to look at, is it too much, is it too soon, is it too long, is it too many? That's all something that has to be figured in. That's in the US. As just sort of aside, in the UK, it's less than 3%. I think that's just interesting. For those types of medications, in 1980 and before, it was a $0 industry. In 2010, it was $10 billion. In 2015, it was $13 billion. In this past year, it was $18 billion. So that aspect of the medication has doubled in the last 10 years. Okay? That is a change that is affecting adolescents. Eyes wide open, being aware of this and what its impact is on that. Okay? We're going to talk about 9 of those. And then I'm going to give you a little bit of time at the end to just kind of talk through it. Number 2, this is like, duh, right? more screen time, just the facts. Just the facts, ma'am. Ages 8 to 12-year-olds, the average of all surveys and studies that have been done, this was 2019, almost 6 hours a day for a child 8 to 12 years old that is actively engaged in screen time. Phones, pads, whatever, TVs, whatever, computers. 13 to 18-year-olds, almost 9 hours a day. Some of it's very good and necessary. We do our schoolwork there, right? We have some communication with mom or dad there. Good stuff. 9 hours a day. It's hard to move through adolescence with 9 hours a day on a screen. 2/3 of the waking time for our children, our adolescent children, are engrossed in screen time. Just a fact, not a judgment, not an opinion. 5 million Americans, mostly men, ages 18 to 30, spend over 45 hours a week on gaming. I know there was some conversation on gaming earlier before we came in here. I don't think it's 45 hours a week for you guys, though. But so you think about the 18 to 30 male, right? Does that have an impact on sort of finally getting through and exiting that roundabout? Probably. Go back to the definition of successfully accomplishing that in Plan A. Taking responsibility, self-reliant, all of those sort of things. 45 plus 75% of leisure time for males 18 to 30 for these 5 million are in gaming. That's an impact. Okay. Number 3, unrestricted access to pornography. And 90% of boys, 70% of girls as teenagers are exposed in some way to pornography. As opposed to 1970, less than 5% of boys, less than 2% of girls. Whoa. And here's the deal. With pornography, it's been known, especially in young, immature minds, as an obsession that becomes a consuming behavior, and adults as well, but it's a different type. It's a more destructive addiction in terms of determining what is real and what is fantasy. Getting through adolescence means I need to sort of figure out what's real and what's fantasy. This is one of the things that's having an impact on that. That's a change to raising children. More time under our parents' roof. 25% of ages 25 to 29 live with a parent. That's not in itself a bad thing. There are definitely good seasons for saying, hey, let's come home, let's work some things out, this works out well, take care of it. Whatever the reasons, there are some really good reasons for being under one roof. That is the result of no plan. It's the result of back with a parent at a home. Okay, I'm back good. I'm back in the roundabout. I'm not being asked to exit. This is comfortable for me. I'm not ready to adult. And so 1/4 of 25 to 29-year-olds are in that situation. Not all of them, but some of them definitely are having that issue with moving out of adolescence. As parents, how are we enabling that? How can we encourage out of that? We'll talk about that here in just a minute. Number 5, again, just a cultural, societal sort of observation, less marriage. If you widen that gap of ages to 18 to 32, there are more individuals living with their parents than are actually married in that same age category. By itself, not an issue, no problem. If it's resulting in extended adolescence, that's a potential issue. That's something. And part of the reason, one of the most stated reasons why this age category is either preferring to live at home or to sort of reject the idea of marriage or family is this idea that family roles are now more burdensome and they're just not worth it. Requires responsibility, requires an idea of, all right, yeah, I guess we've got to pay the bills. You know, we've got to feed the kids. All of these things are just the decisions are being made that are saying, gosh, that's a lot of work. I'm still in adolescence. Remember, adolescence is the opposite of being ready for work. And this is what's being resulted. Okay? Diminishing relationship and social skills. Right? That's all. You throw all of these together, you start to see, man, we really don't have the ability to interact as we once possibly did. Interaction develops maturity. So how are we going to work on that? We've got some recommendations. Less religious participation. Regardless of faith, regardless of denomination, there is less religious participation among that group of millennials born between 1981 and 1996. The majority identify as atheist, agnostic, or nothing in particular. Okay? I think in just sort of church studies, that's not a surprise. We know that. But most, for the reason, though, we don't think about a lot, and it's really the idea of rejecting any type of authority, whether it's a local, congregational, pastoral church authority, or whether it's the authority of Scripture. Okay? That's sort of falling into this, hey, that's too authoritative. We're in Huxley's world. We're not in Orwell's world. So anything authoritative, that's not where we want to be. And there is a connection. There's a connection between a house of faith, growing up in the faith, growing up in a church environment, and moving toward maturity. We think about Scripture, right? When I was a child, I spoke as a child, right? I did childish things. But when I became a man, I matured, I did away with childish things. The Jewish bat mitzvahs, what does that signify? What does age 13 signify? Man. Yeah, adulthood. For centuries and centuries and centuries. A recognition of this is your day. Life, not literally, and not the same sort of full maturity that we're talking about, but this was a place that I would come and I would be recognized as 13 as reaching adulthood. That's pretty important. That can really speak life into a child who's saying, yeah, I'm ready to get going with this. So when there's no connection, we start to lose some of that as well. Number 7, we are little citizens no more. Meaning that those aspects of sort of being involved in our community, being involved in civics, being involved in government, that's not an interest, right? So less than 25% are now proficient in the sort of end-of-year civics and geography studies and exams. On a survey of what do you prefer, 42% preferred socialism over capitalism. Only 16% could actually define what socialism was in a historical context. You could say that also, I'm almost positive you could say the percent that preferred democracy over socialism, a very small percentage of them could actually define democracy in a historical context. So that's an aspect of we're looking for future leaders, right? How do you get involved? How do you make your community better if you're delaying the age for which you can jump in and be part of it? World of adolescence. Really? More intellectually fragile. Okay, what do I mean by that? I'm not necessarily calling out like cancel culture or anything like that. What I'm saying is that we have sort of built into our parenting where we're protecting our children, shielding them from words, ideas that make them feel uncomfortable. I'm not talking about hate speech. There's a clear distinction between those things which should never be said, even under the idea of freedom of speech. That's not what we're saying we're qualifying. We're just saying where there are differences of opinion, we are shielding ourselves from that. We have an inability to accept critical feedback and reality. Remember, adolescence is sort of, we can't really tell fantasy from reality. And so when we go into our workplace at maybe age 25 and we're still in adolescence, and we're told that, hey, you really have to pick it up in this. You're slowing down production. You're talking too much. You get, this is just feedback for you. Well, I quit. I don't want to hear that. Why? You got to be nice, right? So there's an aspect, that's sort of an extreme, but there's an aspect of conversations with those who differ from us. We've sort of moved through this time where we ignore that, we avoid that. In the April equipping class on creeds and confessions and sacraments, I talked about one of the most helpful exercises I ever did. We were talking about the different views of baptism and communion, and one of the most helpful exercises I ever did in seminary was when I had to defend an opposite view. So my paper had to be on one aspect of baptism for which my beliefs and convictions, hit my mic there, sorry, did not align. And what did that do? Did it change my convictions? No. Did it enlighten me on why the other beliefs were like they were? Did I develop a little bit better idea, an understanding of why someone might hold that? Absolutely. And so I think that's an aspect of when we're moving through adolescence, we should be encouraging the idea of sort of allowing the different ideas and not shielding ourselves from that. Does that make sense on that, right? So this extension of adolescence and more intellectual fragility, it's no longer a common practice. And then finally, just kind of a reality, eyes wide open, is softer parenting. Now, this is, again, we're all in this together. I think you could probably argue that there's softer aspects of all of our lives, right? Whether it's work or leisure or, the remote control. I no longer have to go over and hit the next slide on this thing. This is pretty, I just hit it, right? So there's sort of a natural sort of progression to this, but what I want to specifically sort of caution us against and show as a reality is this idea of the helicopter parenting, hovering, whether we do that unintentionally or intentionally. Often you'll ask school teachers, right? School teachers can identify where parents have stepped in and actually performed work just in order to avoid failure for their kid or whatever. And there's a difference here. This isn't I'm going to be irresponsible as a parent, right? This isn't I'm going to let my child play with the stove, right? I'm not going to hover. Just let them turn on the fire. Come on. Or I'm not going to have, as a young child, some kind of guardian software or whatever it is. That's not helicopter parenting. Helicopter parenting is what teachers will tell you often. When kids get to middle school, they get to high school, and the first person they hear about an issue or a complaint or a gripe is the kid's parent and not the kid. So helicoptering is when a parent goes to the coach for his senior in high school and says, "Hey, coach, we've got a problem." And coach says, "Well, Joe's never told me anything. He's never talked to me." "Well, I'm talking to you for Joe." That's helicopter parenting.
And it starts, right?
Yeah, sometimes good intentions, right? Sometimes good intentions, but it's hard. It's hard for parents sometimes to see a child failing at anything, making a puzzle or whatever, and to actually put your hands behind your back and say, well, let's keep working it out. I'm here if you need me, but I'm not going to jump in. Okay. Some other thoughts about this is we've sort of moved into a culture where our kids are kind of this, what they hear more than anything is just be dressed and in the car. Be dressed and in the car. I'll get you there. I'll have your cleats. I'll have your bats. I'll talk to the coach. I've got your paperwork. All you got to do, you've got one job. You've got one job, Junior. Be dressed and in the car. Okay. And so, not only does that sort of coddle and sort of prevent the ability to learn, but it also, in a way, demeans a child from some very important tasks that he or she could be taken care of and growing and learning. And this is one of those things we always talked about that Caitlin, if you show up to the softball game and you don't have your bat or your cleats, you're not playing that day. I'm not going home to get them, and I'm not bringing them for you. I hope you don't forget them because I want to see you play. So those are the sort of just loving conversations that prevent us from really feeling like we're hovering. Even though no matter what you do, the children are always going to feel like you're hovering, right? And sometimes that's that's the needed, responsible versus just the constantly. More than that is just there's no launch plan, right? What is the plan for launching our child? What is the plan for building into them to prevent this? And how are we taking the training wheels off? And you said it, Luke, as well. You got to let them fail. You got to let them fail. I think that was great advice in a similar way. When our girls reached middle school, the principal did an orientation and just said, of all that they're going to learn this whole year, learning to fail is likely going to be one of the most important things. And so if they call you or you're on your way to school and they say, I forgot to do my homework, you're not doing it for them. And you're not going to go to your teacher and ask for another day. You're going to let them experience failure. It's hard as a parent. I'm not saying it's easy, but that's taking the training wheels off, right? So those are all sort of just significant changes the last couple of generations that if we're looking at it with eyes wide open, how do they impact my home, my children, maybe circle of influence where I have care. It was interesting too on this, it's like Tuesday of this week, on the radio, there was an interview with a former Stanford dean who has written a book called, I wrote it down even, Helicopter Parenting is Ruining a Generation of Children. And Julie Hames was this Stanford dean, and the basic premise was that she was seeing more and more young adults every year arriving at college without the basic life skills. Many of them were brilliant. I mean, Stanford, right? Many of them were brilliant with no basic life skills. And as she digs into it, it's, mom and dad always did that. These were 5 that, again, most personally, that Christy and I probably experienced and attempted in our home over the years, and we felt were successful, of ways that we help in spite of all of these barriers and obstacles, in spite of what's going on in a very real sense around us. These are some things that help us transition them to adulthood. And for each of those, what you're going to see is that it's really about developing habits, character building habits. That's one of the primary goals for moving to maturity. It really is, I'm talking about ages 4 and up. We start where we are, but age 4 and up is really where I'm talking about some of these. Pretty much all of them build some aspect of scar tissue, which is part of that necessity of taking the training wheels off. Each requires intentionality and discipline. And I call these sort of bodybuilding for the mind and the soul. Okay? Again, we know the ultimate maturity as far as building their faith. This is going to be more of a practical outworking of that. And so how are we developing their mind and their soul and moving them with that aim of maturity? Okay, so this is one I think is very, very helpful. I would suggest that whatever you can do, desegregate the generations around your children. What I mean by that is that generational segregation is as distinct and as real as it's ever been. It's how we socialize, it's how we work, it's how we worship, it's how we play, it's how we learn. This is the children's table, right? Oh, you young guys, young adults, you're over here. All right, oh, the 40-somethings, yeah, they've got their own league here. Old folks, yeah, we'll meet on Saturday at 4 at Golden Corral, whatever. Yeah, so obviously, we enjoy sort of like-mindedness, and that's important. But it has become so distinct in our culture that our children hardly ever spend quality time around someone other than other children or their parents. And I really have to work at this. 6% of those 60 and over have had a meaningful conversation with anyone under 36 in the last 6 months. I'll let you take that in for a second. If you're over 60 years old, only 6 in 100 have had any sort of conversation with someone under 36 in the last 6 months. That's a segregated generation. Not just the 60s, but the under 36s too, right? When we desegregate generations, one of the things that we don't do today that I think we need to with our children is to embrace death as central to life. Death connects the generations. It encourages urgency. It dispels the sort of fountain of youth. I'm 14, I'm going to live forever. There's the enhancement of hope. As believers in general, we have set aside the idea of death and just removed it from our vocabulary. And it was one of the sermons earlier this spring that David talked about how often the early believers, and we see in Scripture, embrace death as the future hope and glory. There's no hope in life if it wasn't for the reality of death. And so what's happened is we have introduced this idea that, death, it kind of breaks into this whole happiness philosophy. It's hard to walk through the cemetery and still really be skewed to this end of happy, happy, happy. And really, when we embrace it and we teach our children about it, and we don't allow the only exposure they have to death as being a video game or Saw or something, right? There's this fantasy even with death that often our children see as simply a reboot. Oh, my guy died. Reboot. Let's start over. Oh, he's back alive. Whew, I like this death thing. There's no other exposure to it. And when we desegregate generations, we start to see the reality of that. When your teenager has a relationship with someone at the assisted living facility, because they volunteer there, and they learn that this person in assisted living has now passed, that's a maturing situation. There's maturity that happens when an 8-year-old is at a table and hears his grandfather or great-grandfather talk about, having to go to war. Right? Not exasperating our children, but not removing him from those conversations. Now, one of my favorite examples of desegregating generations is getting them involved in an organization that says, hey, I'm going to put you with someone who is 60 years older than you or 60 years younger than you, and you're going to run 3.1 miles. Or more importantly is the time in here, the community time, the table talk time when you see 12-year-olds and 72-year-olds working on the same activity together. That's the sort of thing that, as you can as parents, pursue that. Be intentional about that.
All right, second.
In addition to desegregating generations, we have to help our children embrace work. We really do. Again, not exasperating them, but not removing them from it. We have to remind them, and we have to live it out, that it's a creation mandate. If we go back to Genesis, following the garden, our mandate was to worship and work. Worship and work. Right? There's a rhythm to it as well, right? Worship, work, Sabbath, worship, work. So we have to live that out, and we have to instill that in our children. They need to learn to suffer. They need to learn to surf. They need to learn that the 5 a.m. alarm is a reality. That's what they're moving to, but not to dread it, because it results in independence. It results in freedom. It results in maturity. Weekend schedules. They need to be able to go to a job where they say, hey, for the next 8 hours, you can't use your phone. There's no screen time, And I got to tell you, and I'll say that the family that works together, I think grows together. And I would say that, things that, you can think of 100, maybe it's housework, maybe it's yard work, maybe it's volunteerism, whatever it is, from 4 and up, there is a job for everyone. I would say that suggestion that, housework and yard work is not optional. And there's no guarantee of $1 a week or anything that goes with it. It's the price of being in a community where we all contribute. Isn't that awesome? Man, isn't that awesome? And you know what? We contributed so well this week. Yeah, we are going to go to Dario. Thanks, 5-year-old, for bringing me that broom. Thanks for carrying the leaves, right? So that's the sort of thing. I can tell you too, and again, not to shift back into get off my lawn guy, but I'm convinced, and we see it today with our youth, I'm convinced that my experience from 15 really, before I turned 16, through college, working at the steel mill, alongside adults who had conversations about real life at the break room, who struggled with finances and paychecks and children and relationships and marriages and I had the 5 a.m. alarm, and there were no weekends and holidays. That sort of thing. That's not the same path for everyone. But yeah, I've matured quickly because of my initial push into work, but in embracing it. And when I see our youth, like at Publix, when you see it, one of our youth, or you see someone in Yam at Chick-fil-A, Maggie down there, man, encourage them. I always try to go up to our youth when I see them out working in the community, because man, they're generally the ones you point to and go, yeah, man, he's 15, but he's an old 15. Comparatively in the world today, yeah, absolutely. He's the 15 I want working for me when I hire him and he gets out of school. Encourage them in that, because that's happening, and it's just sort of embracing that. Build from the 4 up, adult work, age appropriate. Take them on tours. There's fun stuff, right? The Jelly Belly tour, or take them to. I know some guys in our church who take their. Well, he was 3, I guess. Started taking them to construction sites, like once a week, to a different, either building a home or building apartment buildings or whatever, just to see how the machines work, and at the same time, seeing that a lot of men and women are out there working hard. And that's something I want to do. Dad, I want to do that. Embrace that. Take them to work, the work tours, all that sort of volunteer. But the key, and however you approach embracing work, is teaching our children to desire productivity, initiate preparation and planning, and then execute it with excellence, right? There are tons of ways, even within our church community, to make that happen. Building beds as a family, whatever, men's service day, bringing the kids out, whatever it is, but getting them in a routine of embracing it. Okay. Number 3, consume less. And I'm going to have to move through these a little bit quicker, but one of the things we said about this, Huxley Brave World is the idea of consumption and consumerism is sort of influencing the pleasure aspect. So teach them to consume less. As Socrates would say, if you're not contented with what you have, you will never be contented with what you'd like to have. So consume less. Teach them that philosophy, that principle. There is a psychological, sort of family psychology sort of thing that is called a happiness portfolio. I can't give you all the details of it, but there are all of these various categories. Surveys after surveys after surveys sort of say, all right, what truly drives the most happy people? Again, this is in a good sense. This isn't like skewed for intention. This is like at the root of it, what brings true happiness in this life? Year after year, these 4 aspects rise to the top of what a truly happy, I'd probably say contented or joy-filled person and family and home is experiencing. And it's a happiness that is associated with a faith, family, work, and community. There's nothing in there about possessions or wealth or anything like that. And so when we consume less, we are building into that happiness portfolio as we're maturing them as well. Define the needs and the wants in your home. Chesterfield, and I wrote it down. I love this. G.K. Chesterfield, who was C.S. Lewis's influence. He said there are 2 ways to get enough, right? One is to continue to accumulate and accumulate. The other is to desire less. So again, a great philosophy in the home. Understand that appetite and culture for consumerism. Model restraint as parents. Live out the principles of delayed gratification. Right? As simple as saying, hey, I know you really want it and you've worked hard for your money, but just like mom and dad, we wait 24 hours before we ever make a big purchase. I'd encourage you to wait 24 hours. And if you still want it, we'll come get it. Start building that principle into them. When they're 6, when they're 7, when they're 8. That'll be there tomorrow, whatever it is. But it's really the mindset and the ability to build that in. Donate together. Pursue activities that are really simplified activities. So how do we overcome it? Number 4, travel to discover. Now, I'm not saying avoid Disney World. I'm not saying don't take them to the fair or anything else like that. But be intentional on some travel with children. Well-traveled tend to be more flexible. They tend to be calm. They tend to be problem solvers. Right? You guys know how travel is, right? Travel is always going to present challenges that we're adapting on the move, opportunities to interact unexpected situations. So when we're well-traveled, we're sort of building that into our children. Mark Twain, not Shania, Mark would say that travel is fatal to prejudice. He says it's fatal to prejudice, bigotry, narrow-mindedness, and many of our people need it sorely on these accounts. And that's the truth. That's the truth. It's easy to sit in our sort of corner and have biases and prejudice against that corner. But when we actually travel to that corner and spend time there, somehow we instantly sort of lose those biases. It's funny how that works. But do that with sort of the purpose of travel. Teachable travel. Let them be part of the planning. From 4 up, let them have meaningful involvement in the planning. Let them, when you hit, like you got the airline tickets, right? Maybe whatever you're on, Expedia or something like that, and you got the tickets, and they're involved in this travel. I used to always like to let the girls come over and say, all right, you're hitting buy, purchase, okay, confirm, whatever it is. Not add to cart, that's something totally different. You're hitting, Lauren, Caitlin, what you're doing is this trip was 3 days of me working. We want to do this, right? Yeah. I think we do. I agree with you. We do want to do it. But I want you to know that when you push this, you've now transferred the funds from 3 days of working to getting these tickets. You good with that? Let's go with that. All right, let's do it. Little, age 6, 7, 8. Teach them to be part of that. When you travel, the first few times, like we'd send them down to the lobby in a hotel, right? Mom and Dad are tired. Go get us some bagels or something, right? There's 7, 8, 9. The first few times, we're going to peek around the corner and keep an eye on them. They spill the juice, though. We're not going to jump out and scold them. That's going to be a let it fail mood, right, or opportunity, right? But let them have meaningful. I used to always allow Lauren to sort of do the transaction at the hotel with my credit card. Give it to them. If you want to stay here tonight, you give them the credit card. We're going to get the car done, right? So those sort of teachable travel things are perfect for developing maturity. Our girls were 6 when they started flying, 6 or 7 when they started flying by themselves, just our families everywhere. Of course they'd have the little thing and the agent would welcome and all that. But that was the result of when they were 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 and continued. When we'd get to the airport, we'd just say, all right, take us to our gate. We're following you. We trust you. We believe in you. If you get us in the wrong terminal, hey, Dad's done that. We've got time. It's all right. But we want to follow you today. So teachable travel is a wonderful way to pursue that maturity. Don't underestimate your child. I've said that to the moms group. I said to the WOW. I will never underestimate your child. I've always told them, you're going to have your children come home to you and say, Mom, Dad, why did Pastor Holcomb ask me about the theology of sanctification? Well, he thought you might want to talk about it. he thought you might be interested. He might want to teach you. Oh, why did he ask me about changing the tire? I'm only 7. He thought you might want to talk about it. He's not underestimating you. Don't underestimate them, right? Allow them to fail. Don't underestimate. It may be a mission trip. What a wonderful way, right? As a family, as a father, daughter, mother, son, whatever it is. Think about that as a way to intentional travel. And then lastly, a little bit out there, firm believer, build a bookshelf with your children. Build a bookshelf. Become literate. In doing that is an active, intentional, mature, developing choice. The average American today reads 19 minutes a day. Does that sound like a lot or no? It doesn't, does it? Right. The average American reads 19 minutes a day. With your child, build categories. Allow them to read, be with them. Bedtime is biographies or fiction or history or biblical study, whatever it is, right? Grow with them. And here's the thing. Raise them as if they are going to rule someday. When you say, man, I sure wish our president would have a better grasp on foreign policy, or I sure wish he'd have a better grasp on the history of, our state, or I sure wish he'd have a better grasp on economics or just on humor or something, right? Well, raise your child as if they're going to be that person you're wishing you had ruling over you. I think that's a good sort of thought. Financial peace. I think every teenager ought to go through financial peace, not the children's edition, the adult edition. Financial peace. Have that as part of what you do together. as if they're ruling the world. Build a bookshelf with your child. So, a lot, again, is sort of like a different sort of conversation. I hope it's a lot to reflect on and think about. In summary, really just 4 points. There are many factors that are causing delayed maturity. We recognize them and we're intentional about how they impact our children. There are active ways we can guide our children, but we have to be purposeful about it. Model adulthood in a way that your child embraces it, desires it, looks forward to following your example one day. Dad, I want to be like you. Mom, I want to be like you. In all of the ways that you are an adult. Not just in your career, or not just in your sports, or whatever it is, but in all the ways that you meet that definition of being an adult, pursuing a sanctified maturity. That's what your child wants to embrace. They want to be like that. And I think of John, I'll close it with this. Again, he was talking about believers in their faith, but he says, I have no greater joy than to hear that my children are walking in the truth. Yes, in terms of their faith, their belief, and I would say that as a parent, there is no greater joy than to hear that my children are walking in the word of the Lord and in the ways of a mature, responsible adult. No greater joy. It is the release. As an empty nester, I still tell you that every year is better than the previous year. Just because you've released them doesn't mean you don't keep growing in relationship with them. And it's because of their maturity.